Philip Gaydon, thank you for being here.
No, my pleasure.
Can you share a time when you changed a long-held belief?
Maybe my second year of my PhD at university was the belief that it was morally acceptable for me to eat meat. What had happened over a long period of time is because I was teaching at the university and I was teaching ethics at the time, and we kept returning to vegetarianism over several years. And each time we had a seminar on it, I left thinking there are no good arguments for me to eat meat. There are no good arguments for it to be morally acceptable for me to eat meat. And eventually I just thought, well, that is a belief that I have to surrender because I just can't get away from this fact because I keep returning to it. It feels intuitively right. And so I have to become vegetarian.
Are there any beliefs you feel you will never abandon and why?
I think probably the belief that we are free beings, that we have free will. And I think this is a really interesting one to think about because it helps us understand, or at least helps me understand the distinction between different types of belief. Because I actually think logically, the arguments for determinism are way better. I think that when you look at the evidence, when you look at the arguments, I do think that determinism seems like the stronger conclusion, which rationally means I should probably hold the belief that determinism is true. But I think by the very nature of the way we act and think, it's impossible to believe that we're not free. So someone could completely convince me with an argument that it is rational to think that we have a deterministic universe and I have no free will. But as soon as I start to act, as soon as I say anything, I'm then going to be acting under the assumption that free will is the case, that I do have free will. So I call this a live belief. So it's just something that I'm constantly living with, that's constantly in the background, that is in the bedrock of everything I do in life. Whereas the idea that even though the logical argument might be better for determinism, I can never believe that I am predetermined, I have no free will, means that that's a dead belief. There's just no way that can ever be brought to life, regardless of how rational it is. So yeah, I don't think I'll ever be surrendering the belief that I have free will.
What does it mean to disagree well?
I think in terms of the conditions for disagreeing well, I think one of the first ones has to be that everybody in the debate is acting in good faith. And what I mean by that is, first of all, that they are willing to be persuaded otherwise, that if they are having a discussion without any possibility that they will change their mind, I don't think they're disagreeing well. Now, maybe I could be convinced to leave that one out if, for example, people were simply open to hearing the other standpoint and then weren't going to yell and scream at each other. And they were just like, okay, I'm just interested in what you have to say, but there's just no chance I'm going to surrender my belief. But I wouldn't necessarily call that disagreeing. So I think that, yeah, to disagree well, you have to be going into it being open to having your mind changed and having be convinced by the other people that you're disagreeing with. I also think disagreeing well has to be free of certain fallacies. So I think something like if people are disagreeing with the tu quoque fallacy involved, like the you too, so, oh, well, hang on a second, you're accusing me of this thing, you did it too, therefore I'm off the hook. Those kind of things that we maybe see more in politics or in law or something like that, I think it has to be free of those because they are clearly not being driven by the end goal of getting at truth. They're driven in the sense of personal attacks on each other. And so ad hominem would be another fallacy that needs to be removed because that's all about rhetoric and winning the debate and convincing other people regardless of the truth. And I think both of those things are underpinned by a commitment to the truth. So I think that commitment to the truth is absolutely of imperative importance for disagreeing well. And as I said, I think the other condition then is that you're entering with your the ability to have your mind changed and that you're on the lookout and the debate is free from particular fallacies that are tied to kind of rhetorically attacking each other.
And finally, how can schools and universities promote good disagreement?
So, I mean, part of this, I think, is educating around those kind of fallacies. So I think it's important that those kind of things are noticed, those kind of things are called out, that they're things that are there in every classroom that wants to disagree well, so that people can have that language, be able to say, oh, that's something we agreed we weren't going to do, things like that. I think as someone who teaches as well as philosophy, so that's personal, social, health, and economic education, most famous for relationships and sex education. But if you're going to have those kind of disagreements, then in those kind of situations, you also need to be able to hold that space where ways of expressing yourself, not all ways of expressing yourself are accepted. So you have certain ground rules about the way you can express yourself and the way you can put your points forward, but that no particular points are off limits. And the reason for this is because if people can't actually express their opinion, then they're not necessarily disagreeing, right? Or they're not disagreeing openly and in the best possible way. So, working with the Philosophy Foundation, things like the idea of an open question mindset. So, the idea that I'm not just trying to get pupils in the room to guess what's in my head, but that I genuinely want to hear what's in their head. So, I'm asking questions that are designed to be as open as possible. Now, they can be closed questions. So, the Philosophy Foundation has this great distinction between grammatically closed, grammatically open, but then conceptually closed and conceptually closed and conceptually open. So, as long as all questions are conceptually open, then I think eliciting actually held beliefs, no matter what they are, is really, really important. Now, someone might come back at that and say, well, hang on a second, what if they hold truly horrific and immoral opinions? Then I would say, well, at that point, you're not necessarily in the room as a true facilitator because you're not facilitating that disagreement. You're in there as someone who thinks there are certain truths about things, and so certain things are morally false and that or morally abhorrent. And so again, in the Philosophy Foundation, there's this distinction between true ignorance and what we might call kind of Socratic ignorance. So one of the theories might be that a question like Socrates, is he actually open-minded and is he actually allowing people to fill the gap with what they truly believe, or is he asking questions just to lead them to a certain point which he thinks he already knows? And there's a debate around whether Socrates is feigning his ignorance or not. But if you're coming to a space as a true facilitator, then it's got to be to truly let everything come out and have a discussion. Now, as I said, morally, things that you take to be morally abhorrent. So let's say we're worried about something like the Equalities Act or a hate crime or someone, using hate speech in a classroom, then we can put that under the category of ways we express ourselves. As I said before, so there's certain ground rules about how you express yourself. But I really think there are very few things that, if expressed correctly, should be off limits. Now, to qualify that, I think the number one important things for schools and universities to do if they're wanting true opinions and controversial things to be expressed is to constantly put emphasis on the expression of argument. So let's say someone says something intuitively abhorrent. So let's take a step back and go back to when we were doing intervention lessons around Andrew Tate, for example, and it might be any lesson on the manosphere or something like that. And someone expresses a really misogynistic belief that they picked up on, online. And the important thing is not then to ban what's been said, although have a word about how it's been said, maybe if it's hateful or harmful, but then to say, okay, what's the argument for that position? And get the argument out there rather than settle on the conclusion, so that then everyone can go through the argument and analyze it and critique it. So in terms of, just to try and summarize that, what's really important for universities and schools to do, I think that it's important to have ground rules about how you express yourself, but I think it's important to think very carefully about whether you actually want to say any certain things are off limits to discuss at all. And hopefully, if you're taking a truly facilitatory mindset, then you would say, well, nothing's off limits as long as it's expressed within our rules. But what we really need to do then is emphasize what are the arguments, and we need to spend our time truly drawing out what is in people's minds using techniques like Question X from the Philosophy Foundation, again, using a closed question to get an open question, kind of anchoring and facilitation tools that they use.